Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm tackling the question, is Super Mario 64 the greatest 3D platformer ever made? It is not technically the first 3D platformer, but it was the first, like, blockbuster AAA 3D platformer. And so it is the one that set the gold standard for what a 3D platformer should look and play and sound like. And so it was also the flagship title on the Nintendo 64. And yes, when I did buy my N64, it was the very first game I got. Now, many of you have already seen my video, You're Remembering the N64 Wrong. And in that video, my number one complaint with the N64 was the fact that it was, by and large, for the most part, a very heavy local multiplayer console. And someone like me who didn't have local friends to play with didn't get a lot of value in the multiplayer aspect of the N64. That's not to say I didn't enjoy the system, because I did. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy some of the games on it, because I do. And Super Mario 64 is literally one of my favorite video games of all time. So, I do apologize if I may have misled people into believing I hate the N64, because I don't. I just think that some people probably had a different experience with it than I did. Most people, in fact. And I thought that was worth pointing out. Now, I had other complaints with the N64, like the controller, the cartridges, the lack of third-party games, and so on and so forth. But overall, it wasn't a bad console, and Mario 64 is the opposite of a bad game. It's one of the greatest video games of all time. So to that end, I want to analyze, is it the greatest 3D platformer ever? So, for reference, I did have a PlayStation 1 and a PS2 and a GameCube and a Wii and a Wii U and a PS3. So I have played an Xbox and an Xbox 360, a Switch, a DS. I've played most of the big hits, the big 3D platformers. Because at one point in time, I kind of thought I really liked 3D platformers, because I do really like 2D platformers. And I really loved Super Mario 64. As time went on, I slowly started to realize that none of the 3D platformers I was playing could recapture the magic of Mario 64. None of them were as good as Mario 64. And eventually, I came to the realization that I wasn't as big of a fan of the genre as I initially thought I was. And this is partially because Super Mario 64 is a 5 out of 5 perfect game. And most 3D platformers are 2.5, 3 stars at best. They just don't cut the mustard. So one of the things that made Super Mario 64 so great is the fact that it actually did utilize the wonky N64 controller in a way that made sense for that game. Now, I will eventually do a retrospective on Ocarina of Time, where I'm going to bitch about how shitty the controller was for that game. But for Mario 64, it worked. It was a pretty good controller, and it worked well. That game didn't quite sell the controller 100%, but it at least said, okay, this controller isn't the piece of rubbish that we think it is, until we play games like Turok, and then we're like, oh yeah, maybe it is a piece of rubbish. I don't know. So, I remember reading about Super Mario 64 in the magazines. Electronic Gaming Monthly. No, I didn't have Nintendo Power. I didn't read that. I had Sega Visions, so, there is that. But I do remember reading GamePro and Game Informer and other random magazines, some of which are long forgotten, and I don't even remember the titles of all of them. But the number one magazine I read was Electronic Gaming Monthly. I did have a subscription to that for a while. and EGM2, which was a short-lived spin-off that I also had for a while. Now, I also read Wizard magazine, and they had a video game section. And so there was a time leading up to the launch of the N64 where every magazine issue had an article on Super Mario 64. So I was reading about this game for a very long time before it came out. And I was very hyped to get it. Now, I have told pieces of this story in other videos, so I'll recap. I had a job throwing newspapers. I was a delivery person for a newspaper company after school. And I had a summer job detasseling corn in the cornfield. So I had money in 1996. I went to Kmart and I pre-ordered an N64. They let me put it on layaway, and I paid it off on launch day. I paid it off, and I had it in the car. I was taking it home, and on the way home, my dad stopped off at a pawn shop for whatever reason, I don't remember. And when I was at the pawn shop, I saw two things that caught my eye. One, they had about 70% of a drum set. They had a snare drum, a hi-hat stand, two tom-toms, and a floor tom. They didn't have a bass drum. There was no pedal. But I had drumsticks. I played drums in school. And so I really wanted this drum set. And they had a Super Nintendo, which I didn't have because I had a Sega Genesis at the time, and a shoebox full of Super Nintendo games for $50. Now, this was a good price in 1996 for a Super NES and a shoebox full of about 12 or so games. Some of the games were Super Mario World, Legend of Zelda, and a bunch of other games. I don't remember them all, but I do remember specifically those two games were in the bundle. So I told my dad I wanted to go back to Kmart and return my N64 and go back to the pawn shop with my money and buy that drum set and that Super Nintendo. And after a short argument with me, he relented and agreed to do this. And that's what I did. And so that was when I got my Super Nintendo in 1996, the day the N64 came out. So I didn't get another Nintendo 64 until the year 2000, September, again, 4 years later, on my 18th birthday. Now, at this point, I was working a full-time job at the casino. I was working as a bus person in the buffet. And I was making good money at the time for a kid, And so I had my birthday money that my parents gave me. I had my paycheck. I had my tips I saved up for a couple weeks. I went to Software Etc. because this was before GameStop bought them or renamed them. And I bought, same day, a Nintendo 64 with 3 games and a Sony PlayStation with 3 games. And one of the games I got on the 64, obviously, was Super Mario 64. So, the game itself, I had been hyped for a long time. Now, I had not played Super Mario 64 up to this point, but I had played other N64 games at different friends' houses over the years. So I had some experience with some of the multiplayer games. So I had already played, Smash Brothers. Not Smash Brothers yet. I meant to say I had already played Mario Party and Mario Kart and, some of the other multiplayer games. I don't remember them all. So I was already familiar with the N64 library. And so at this point I was wanting one. Because I wanted one, so I got it. And I immediately, first thing I did was played Super Mario 64, and I was blown away. However, there's a couple things I want to point out. First thing I want to point out, I didn't get my N64 until my 18th birthday. I had already spent most of my teen years really heavily heavily deep into the Sega library. And so I was kind of shifting back to Nintendo away from Sega at this point. Because I bypassed the Dreamcast altogether, but that's a whole other video for another day. And so my first impression playing Super Mario 64 for the first time was it was very impressive. I was blown away. Even though the PlayStation 2 was like literally maybe a month, maybe 2 months away from coming out. The PS1 was already out with a shit ton of games. The Dreamcast was already out. So there were already systems that were supplanting or replacing the N64 with, you know, presumably better games. So, although I was impressed with Super Mario 64, it wasn't as impressive at that time as it would have been had I played it in 96, 4 years earlier. Because the N64 itself was only a year away from being replaced by the GameCube. Which is another video for another day. So, because I actually love the GameCube. So, you know, all you people out there that think I just hate Nintendo, I don't. The GameCube is one of my favorite game consoles of all time. So there is that. And I have owned every single Nintendo home console that they have ever made. So I have plenty of experience with Nintendo. Now, Mario 64, what did impress me was, one, the controls were amazing. And two, the graphics were pretty phenomenal for the time. And three, it had really good music. However, I'm going to be honest. There were some things about the game I initially didn't like. That I either grew to accept over time, or eventually I just didn't care. So the first thing I didn't like immediately was the fact that there was no two-player mode. Now, you have assholes who will say, well, you couldn't do that game two-player. I mean, unless they did split screen. And I want to punch them in the face and tell them no. Super Mario Brothers on the NES wasn't split screen and it was two-player. You literally just fucking take turns. That's it. Mario jumps out of the pipe, runs into the castle, beats a level, collects a star, the screen goes black, Luigi pops out of the pipe, runs into the castle, beats a level, collects a star. You just take turns. So don't come at me with there were hardware limitations. They absolutely could have fucking done Super Mario 64 two-player. They made a conscious decision not to, and at the time, I thought that was the wrong decision. Now, to be fair, they did make up for this with ass ton of multiplayer Mario-themed games like Smash Brothers and Mario Kart and Mario Party and Mario Golf and Tennis and Strikers and so on and so forth. But at the time, this was a strike for me against the game. I was disappointed that Luigi wasn't in the game. The other thing that I had a complaint about the game was I had already played the 3 NES games. I'd already played the Super Nintendo game and some of the Game Boy games. I was a little bit confused why there weren't more Koopas in this game. You had Goombas all over the place. You had Piranha Plants all over the place. You had a shit ton of new original enemies specifically for this game. You had Bob-ombs all over the place, which Bob-ombs had only been somewhat featured in a handful of levels in previous Mario games, so they weren't even like one of the top 5 common enemies. But the Koopa Troopa was strangely absent for most of the game. And so this, to me, was a strike against the game. It's like, where are the Koopas? Bowser is literally the king of the Koopas, and there are no Koopas in this game. Lakitu makes an appearance in, I think, 1 or maybe 2 levels, and there are Koopa shells. You can ride around like a skateboard or snowboard, depending on the level. And there's one level that I can remember that has one Koopa that you can stomp on and take his shell. And it's the only level that had a Koopa Troopa in it. There were no Koopa Paratroopas anywhere in this game. It just seemed weird. Like, if they would have just had one Koopa Troopa in, like, half the overworld levels, I would have been like, okay, fine. That would have satisfied me. Now, again, these are nitpicks. These aren't things that make me say the game is rubbish, so don't take this the wrong way. I'm just telling you how I felt in 2000 when I was 18 years old playing this game for the first time. And then my other nitpick was the fact that it didn't have power-up mushrooms, so you couldn't grow big and break blocks. You were already big and you could break blocks anyways, but you didn't shrink. So that was a staple of the franchise, and I was like, wait a minute. That was weird. And there was no Fire Flower. Now, seeing how the Fire Flower was implemented in future 3D Mario games, and considering what we know about this game being rushed, I would say they made the right call, not including the Fire Flower. But I have no explanation for why there aren't more Koopas in this game, considering that Goombas are in nearly every level. So, I don't know. Now, yeah, there's Big Koopa or Koopa the Great or whatever his name is that you race up the hill. So it's not totally void of Koopas entirely. I just remember at the time feeling a little let down that there weren't more Koopas. And to me, there weren't enough mushroom levels. There just weren't enough mushrooms in the game, having taken place in the Mushroom Kingdom. Whereas, like, you know, aside from Mario Brothers 2, which existed in its own world, and Super Mario World, which did heavily feature mushrooms, even though it was Dinosaur Island, mushrooms were a big part of the Mario franchise. And there were mushrooms in a handful of levels, just not enough of them for my taste. However, these were not minor nitpicks that didn't stop me from enjoying the game. There were levels that I loved so much, and I loved replaying some of those levels so much, that I used all 4 save files on my cartridge, that I would literally only play the first 2 floors. And then after I got to the 3rd floor, I would start a new save and start back at the beginning. So, for one, I never beat this game. And 2, I didn't like the 3rd floor levels anyways. The clock or the Rainbow Road or whatever. I didn't like those levels. So, I never really got to the end of the game. Now, I did make it all the way to the final boss, but I couldn't beat him. I've never beat that final boss. Again, that's not a strike against the game. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm just saying I never could. So, I remember being impressed by the underwater levels. The pirate ship level is one of my favorite levels in the game. The tower level, the sky tower level on the 1st floor is one of my favorite levels in the game. I like both of the snow levels, pretty much. I do like the desert level, the desert temple level. I like most of the overworld levels. I don't like the Misty Cave level. I don't like the lava level. I'm indifferent on the village level, the one where you have to jump into the painting at different points to raise or lower the water level. That level kind of bothered me a little bit, but I don't hate it. It was just like, it felt like that was too specific to Super Mario 64. That level didn't have enough traditional Mario elements for me. It just felt too foreign to me for my tastes. I hate the Clock Tower level, and I don't like the Rainbow Road level. The Rainbow Bridge, or whatever the fuck it is. And as far as the hidden levels, the Switch Palaces, or whatever they're called, I never found all of them. I never found the metal hat, and I only found the invisible hat and the flying hat. Those were the only 2 hats I ever found. So if there are other hats in the game, I never found them, so I don't know about them, or I don't watch like Let's Plays of this or anything like that. So yeah. But anyways, I do remember playing the shit out of this game and having a lot of fun. So one thing I remember is, for one, the controls are fucking amazing. And I like how, even though this was a full-on dedicated 3D platformer, you could play it some levels, not all, but some levels, as 2D side-scrollers, depending on how you angled the camera, which is what I did when I first played this game. I tried to play it like a 2D side-scroller, especially the castles. As I got better at the game and I started to get better at moving around in the 3D space, playing other 3D games like Sonic Adventure and Donkey Kong 64, etc. Once I got more comfortable moving around in a 3D space, I went back and tried the game again, playing it in third-person view, and I got better at the game. I got further in the game, and I realized that it wasn't designed to be played side-scrolling, even though it was an option for old-timers like me who were averse to change. So this video's getting long. There's a lot of great things about Super Mario 64 to enjoy. The cameras are a little wonky by today's standards, and even the standards of games that came after it, but for the most part, it works pretty good. The difficulty level is right on par with other Mario games. It's not impossible to beat, but it's some of the puzzles are challenging enough that you're gonna replay those puzzles multiple times and get some replay value out of the game, and this extends the length of the game, which is good. When you're a kid, you want the game, you don't want to just sit down and beat it in an hour, you know, and then you're like, well, shit, that sucked. So, you know, you wanted to take your time and explore everything. Now, I do have to take a sidebar and talk about the haunted house level. The reason why I want to talk about this one separate is because I am deathly afraid of clowns. And I know there are no clowns in the haunted house level, but that merry-go-round in the basement of the haunted house does play creepy carnival music, and that level scares me. Like, specifically, that level legitimately scares me, even today as an adult. So, I did not like playing the haunted house level, even though I like haunted house levels from previous Mario games, and I love horror and haunted houses in real life and ghost stories and things like that. That level was just a little too intense for me. I did eventually beat it, and I got all the coins, but it was a chore. Now, this is where I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in everything. I did not keep my N64 for very long back in the day. I replaced it pretty quickly for a GameCube when I got the opportunity to get a GameCube. Now, I never had more than maybe 15 to 20 N64 games. And even though, like I said, I was mostly playing single-player games, I was looking for single-player games. I did find a lot of good single-player games on the system, so don't get me wrong. I do have a list of the top 25 greatest N64 games of all time. That list is coming, and you might be surprised at how well I enjoyed some of those games. If you've only previously watched my, other N64 video, where I was a little more harsh on it than I maybe could have been. But, it is what it is. I did not play Mario 64 for very long on an actual Nintendo 64. Most of my experience playing Super Mario 64 comes much later, playing the emulator, the virtual console N64 ROM on the Nintendo Wii Virtual Console and the Wii U Virtual Console, and then later on the Switch, on the HD Anniversary Collection or whatever that had Mario 64 and Sunshine on it, and I think Galaxy, but I don't remember. So I mostly played Mario 64 on hardware that had dual analog joysticks. And I think, despite the game being made for the N64 controller, I think it plays better with dual analog joysticks than it does the single joystick and the camera buttons on the N64. So, for me personally, I would rather play Super Mario 64 on the Wii or the Wii U or the Switch or on a PC using a controller with dual analog sticks. It just feels right to me. That being said, the game actually does work well with dual analog sticks. It translated well to modern hardware, leading me back to the question I asked at the top of the video: does it hold up? Is it still the greatest 3D platformer? And I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to say yes for a lot of reasons. One of which is it still plays well on modern hardware. It's not awkward at all. There are games that were made for the Intellivision that specifically utilize the Intellivision controller in such a way that make those games nearly impossible to play on modern hardware because they just lack the buttons. So, or they don't have the correct button layout or whatever. So yes, I will say, coming off of that, yeah, the N64, Super Mario 64 as a game does translate well to modern hardware and modern controls. So it holds up in that regard. It still looks good, even for the time. In fact, I would argue, due to the simplicity of the graphics and how bright and colorful they are, Mario 64 actually holds up better than a lot of the N64 games that attempted to use more realistic looking graphics, because the N64 just wasn't capable of that. And so using the cartoony style graphics on Mario 64 makes the game look better and hold up better today than some of the games like Turok or Perfect Dark or, Jet Force Gemini, etc., that go for a more realistic graphical style that just doesn't work well on the N64 because it doesn't have the texture capabilities due to the hardware limitations of it being a cartridge, etc. So Nintendo knew the limits of the machine when they designed Super Mario 64. And so I think it holds up better than some of its predecessors. Or, excuse me, successors. Shit, I get those two words mixed up. Fuck. I know, I promise I did go to college, but, I'm 41 years old. I have bipolar disorder. My brain is a fog. So, yeah. Anyways, I do think Super Mario 64 is the greatest 3D platformer ever, and I will die on that hill.